Somewhere near the end of the last ice age, something very quiet and very strange began to happen. The world did not end with a loud explosion or a great fire in the sky. There were no warnings carved into stone, no sudden darkness that covered the sun. Instead, the change came gently, almost silently. At first, no one would have understood what was happening. A slightly colder wind, a river that froze a little earlier than usual, animals moving in ways that felt unfamiliar. And then, over what may have felt like only a short time, the earth itself began to grow colder, very cold, so cold that vast regions of the northern hemisphere slipped back into icy conditions, even though the world had already begun warming after the Ice Age. This moment, which happened around 12,800 years ago, is still one of the most puzzling mysteries in Earth's history. Scientists today call it the Younger Dryas. But even now, no one knows exactly why it happened. And perhaps even more strangely, it may have happened almost overnight. Now let us settle in slowly. Take a deep breath and allow your mind to wander gently into the distant past. Tonight, we will travel back to a time long before cities, before written history, before even the earliest civilizations we usually learn about. A time when humans lived close to nature, when survival depended on understanding the land, the seasons, and the sky. And as we move through this quiet story, we will slowly uncover what may have happened during this mysterious moment, not in a rush, but step by step, like walking through a fog where shapes appear slowly. To begin, we must first understand the world just before this sudden cooling. Around 13,000 years ago, the Earth was changing. For a very long time before that, the planet had been locked in the grip of an ice age. Massive sheets of ice covered much of North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. These were not small glaciers. They were enormous, stretching for thousands of kilometers, thick enough to reshape entire landscapes. But slowly, very slowly, the earth had begun to warm. The ice was retreating. Rivers were flowing again. Forests were starting to grow in places that had once been frozen and empty. Animals began returning to these lands, and humans quietly followed them. Imagine standing on a wide open plain. The air is still cool but not painfully cold. Grass moves gently in the wind. In the distance, you might see herds of large animals, mammoths, bison, deer. Early humans would have lived here. They moved with the seasons, following food, following water. They did not know about climate systems or global temperatures, but they understood patterns. They knew when the cold would come and when it would leave, or at least they thought they did. Because something unexpected was about to interrupt this slow warming, something that did not follow the usual rhythm of nature. Around 12,800 years ago, the warming trend suddenly stopped. And then it reversed. Temperatures dropped, not just slightly but sharply. In some regions, the climate returned to near ice age conditions. Cold winds swept across lands that had only recently begun to recover. Glaciers stopped melting, and in some places they began to grow again. It was as if the earth had taken a step backward in time. Now, Here is where the mystery deepens. This change appears to have happened very quickly, not over thousands of years, which is how climate usually shifts, but possibly over just decades or even less. Some evidence suggests the cooling may have begun within a human lifetime. Imagine that. One generation living in a warming world and the next facing a sudden return of the cold. For the people living at that time, this would not have been an abstract idea. It would have been real, felt in their bodies, seen in the land, experienced every day. Food would have become harder to find. Plants that once grew reliably might have failed. Animals may have changed their migration patterns or disappeared from familiar areas. Water sources could have frozen or shifted, and slowly, quietly, survival would have become more difficult. But this raises a gentle question. What could cause such a sudden shift? What could make the entire climate of the Earth change so quickly? Scientists have been trying to answer this for many years. And while there are several ideas, none of them fully explain everything. One of the most widely discussed ideas involves something called ocean circulation. Now let us think about this in a simple way. The oceans of the Earth are not still. They move constantly. Warm water travels from the equator toward the poles. Cold water moves in the opposite direction. This movement helps regulate the planet's temperature. In a way, it acts like a global heating system. Today, we know one part of this system as the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. It is a long name, but the idea is simple. Warm water flows northward in the Atlantic Ocean. As it reaches colder regions, it cools, becomes heavier, and sinks. Then it flows back south, deep beneath the surface. This cycle continues slowly, steadily. Now imagine if this system were suddenly disrupted. If the warm water stopped reaching the north, those regions would become colder, much colder. Some scientists believe that this is exactly what may have happened. But then comes another question. What could interrupt such a massive system? One idea involves melting ice. At the end of the Ice Age, huge amounts of fresh water were being released into the oceans. From melting glaciers from large lakes formed by ice dams. One of these lakes, known as Lake Agassiz, was enormous, far larger than any modern lake. It held vast quantities of fresh water. If for some reason this water were suddenly released into the ocean, it could dilute the salt water. And this matters more than it might seem, because salt water is denser than fresh water, and the sinking of cold, salty water is a key part of that ocean circulation system. So if too much fresh water entered the ocean, it could slow down or even stop that sinking process. And if that happens, the entire system could weaken. And if the system weakens, the north becomes colder. It is a quiet chain of events, but a powerful one. Yet, even this explanation does not answer everything, because the timing and the speed of the cooling still raise questions. And so, another idea has been suggested, a more unusual one that feels almost like something from a distant story. Some researchers have proposed that a comet or asteroid may have struck the Earth around this time. Not necessarily a single large impact, but possibly fragments, pieces breaking apart in the atmosphere or hitting different regions. If such an event occurred, it could have sent dust and debris into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight, cooling the planet. There are some clues that support this idea. Tiny particles found in certain layers of soil, materials that may form under extreme heat like that produced during impacts. But again, the evidence is not clear enough, not strong enough to confirm this as the true cause. And so, the mystery remains. As time passes slowly, the Earth stayed in this colder state for over 1,000 years. This was not a brief moment. It was a long period stretching across many human lifetimes. During this time, humans continued to adapt. They always have. In some regions, people may have changed the way they lived, shifting from hunting large animals to gathering smaller, more reliable food sources. In other places, new tools and techniques may have developed, quiet changes happening slowly, in response to a changing world. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the cold period ended. Around 11,700 years ago, temperatures rose again, rapidly. The Earth warmed and entered the stable climate we know today, the Holocene. This is the climate in which all human civilization has developed. Farming, cities, writing, everything we know. Which brings us to another quiet thought. If that sudden cooling had lasted longer, if the climate had remained unstable, would human history have unfolded in the same way? Would agriculture have developed? Would cities have formed? Or would humanity have taken a completely different path? We do not know. But perhaps that is what makes this moment so fascinating. Not just what happened, but what almost continued to happen. Now let us move a little deeper into this story. Because beyond the science, beyond the ice and oceans, there is something else to consider. How did humans experience this change? Not as numbers or graphs, but as daily life. As seasons that no longer behaved as expected, as a world that slowly, quietly became uncertain. And in that uncertainty, what did they feel? What did they think? Did they notice the shift right away, or did it come so gradually that it only became clear over time? This is where history becomes very quiet, because there are no written records from this time. Only traces, clues, small pieces left behind. And yet, those small pieces tell us something important. Humans did not disappear. They adapted, they moved, they changed. Which may be one of the most remarkable parts of this story. Not the cold itself, but the quiet resilience of those who lived through it. And as we continue this journey, we will slowly explore more of these clues, more of these possibilities, and perhaps get just a little closer to understanding what really happened 12,800 years ago. As the cold settled more deeply into the world, it did not arrive all at once like a storm. It moved slowly but with quiet certainty. Year by year, the warmth that had once been returning began to fade again. In some places, summers grew shorter. Winters stretched longer. The land, which had only just begun to soften after thousands of years of ice, seemed to hesitate as if unsure whether it should continue changing or return to what it once was. Imagine waking each morning in such a world. At first, nothing feels too different, but then small patterns begin to shift. A river that used to flow freely now carries thin sheets of ice along its edges. A familiar path through the land becomes harder to walk, covered in frost long after the sun has risen. The air feels sharper, quieter. For early humans, these changes would not have been explained with words like climate shift or global systems. Instead, they would have felt it directly, in their hands, in their breath, in the behavior of the animals around them. Animals are often the first to respond to change, and during this time their movements likely began to shift. Large herds may have moved farther south or in different directions than before. Some species, already living near the edge of their survival, may have begun to disappear entirely. Among them were the great mammals of the Ice Age, creatures like the woolly mammoth, the giant ground sloth, and the saber-toothed cat. These animals had lived through cold conditions before, but this time something was different. The environment was no longer stable. It was changing too quickly, not just colder but unpredictable. And when an environment becomes unpredictable, survival becomes uncertain, even for the strongest creatures. For humans, this meant something important. Their way of life depended on these animals, on knowing where they would go, when they would arrive, how they would behave. But now those patterns were breaking, and when patterns break, a people must adapt. Some groups may have followed the animals as they moved, traveling longer distances, exploring new lands. Others may have stayed but changed their way of living, relying more on smaller animals, plants, seeds, learning new skills, finding new ways to survive in a colder, less predictable world. And slowly, quietly, these small changes began to shape the future. Now, as we move gently deeper into this story, we begin to see something interesting. Because this period of cold, this Younger Dryas, does not only appear in one place, its traces are found across large parts of the Earth. In ice cores taken from places like Greenland, scientists can see layers of ice that formed year after year. Each layer holds tiny bubbles of ancient air, a record of past temperatures, a frozen memory of the atmosphere. And within these layers there is a clear signal, a sudden drop in temperature, followed by a long period of cold, and then a sudden warming again. It is like reading a quiet story written in ice. But ice is not the only place where this story appears. Sediments at the bottom of lakes, pollen trapped in ancient soil, even caves hold clues. In these places, scientists study tiny details. What kinds of plants were growing? How much dust was in the air? What kinds of animals were present? And together, these clues begin to form a picture. A world that changed quickly and then remained cold for a long time. But here is where another gentle question begins to appear. If this change was global, why do some places show stronger effects than others? In some regions, the cooling was very intense. In others, it was more subtle, a shift but not as dramatic. This suggests that the cause may not have been a single, simple event, but rather a combination of changes working together. The oceans, the atmosphere, the ice, all connected, all influencing each other. And when one part of the system changes, it can affect everything else. Let us return for a moment to the idea of freshwater entering the oceans, because this remains one of the most widely accepted explanations. As the great ice sheets melted, they did not simply disappear. They released enormous amounts of water. This water often collected in large lakes, held back by walls of ice. Lake Agassiz was one of these, a vast body of water stretching across what is now parts of North America. Imagine a lake so large that it feels more like an inland sea, cold, quiet, held in place by the remains of glaciers. Now imagine that barrier of ice beginning to weaken, cracking slowly under pressure. And then at some moment it gives way. The water rushes out, not gently but with great force, flowing into the ocean, changing its balance. If enough fresh water entered the North Atlantic, it could have disrupted the ocean circulation, slowing the flow of warm water to the north. And as that flow weakened, the climate would respond, cooling. This idea is simple in concept, but powerful in effect. Yet still there are uncertainties, because the timing of these events does not always match perfectly. And science, like this story, moves slowly, piece by piece. Now let us consider something else, something more subtle: dust. During colder periods, the earth often becomes drier in certain regions. Less plant life, more exposed soil. And when winds pass over this dry land, they carry dust into the atmosphere. This dust can travel great distances, crossing continents, filling the air. And dust in the atmosphere can reflect sunlight, reducing the amount of energy that reaches the surface, leading to further cooling. So now we begin to see a pattern: fresh water disrupting ocean currents, dust affecting sunlight, ice reflecting more heat back into space. Each of these changes may seem small on their own, but together they can create a powerful shift. It is like many quiet voices speaking at once, each one soft, but combined they become something stronger. And still the question remains: was this enough to cause such a sudden change, or was there something else? Let us return briefly to the idea of an impact from space. It is a more dramatic possibility, but one that continues to be studied. In certain places, scientists have found tiny particles called microspherules, small, round bits of material that may form under intense heat. There are also traces of something called platinum, a rare element that can be associated with cosmic material. These clues appear in layers of Earth that date to around the beginning of the Younger Dryas. Some researchers believe this could be evidence of a comet breaking apart in the atmosphere, or fragments striking the surface. If such an event occurred, it could have caused fires, released dust, changed the atmosphere. But here the story becomes uncertain again, because not all scientists agree. Some believe the evidence is not strong enough. Others think it may be explained in different ways. And so this idea remains a possibility, not a conclusion. As time continues to pass, the cold period holds steady. For over 1,000 years, the Earth remains in this cooler state. Human groups continue to live, to adapt, to survive. And in some regions, something very important may have begun to develop. A new way of living. Before this time, humans were mostly hunter-gatherers, moving with the land, following food. But during this colder, less predictable period, some groups may have begun to settle more, staying in one place for longer periods. Not fully farming yet, but beginning to experiment, to observe plants more closely, to understand cycles. It is a quiet shift, but a meaningful one. Because when people stay in one place, they begin to change their relationship with the land. They notice patterns more deeply. They begin to shape their environment even in small ways. And over time, this may lead to something new, something that would later become agriculture. So in a way, this cold period, this disruption, may have played a role in the development of human civilization. Not directly, not suddenly, but as part of a long, slow process. Which brings us back to a quiet reflection. Sometimes change does not only create difficulty, it also creates new paths, paths that would not have existed otherwise. Now, as we continue this journey, we will move even deeper into the human side of this story. Not just what happened to the climate, but how people lived through it. How they understood it, if they understood it at all. And what traces of their experience still remain hidden in the earth, waiting quietly to be discovered. As we move a little deeper into the scientific side of this mystery, the story becomes quieter, but also more detailed. It is no longer just about cold winds and shifting animals. Now we begin to look at the smallest traces, the almost invisible clues left behind in the earth itself. Clues that scientists read carefully, like a slow and patient conversation with the past. One of the most important of these clues comes from ice. Not just any ice, but very old ice. Ice that has been building up for thousands of years, layer by layer like pages in a book. In places like Greenland and Antarctica, scientists drill deep into the ice sheets. They extract long cylinders of ice called ice cores. Each layer in these cores represents a year, sometimes even a single season. And trapped inside these layers are tiny bubbles of ancient air, air from a world long gone. By studying these bubbles, scientists can understand what the atmosphere was like in the past. They can measure gases like carbon dioxide and methane. They can even estimate temperature changes. And when they look at the time around 12,800 years ago, they see something very clear. A sudden drop, a sharp shift. It is not gradual, it is not slow, it is quick, at least in geological terms. This is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that something unusual happened, because the Earth's climate usually changes slowly. But here, it behaves differently. Now let us move to another kind of clue, one that comes not from ice but from the bottom of lakes. Over time, lakes collect layers of sediment, tiny particles of soil, dust, plant material, slowly settling at the bottom, year after year. These layers can be studied in a similar way to ice cores. Each layer tells a story. In some lakes, scientists have found a thin, dark layer that appears around the beginning of the Younger Dryas. This layer contains unusual materials, charcoal, tiny fragments of burned plants, which suggests something interesting, that large fires may have occurred around this time. But where did these fires come from? One possibility is natural climate change, dry conditions leading to wildfires. But another possibility connects back to the idea of an impact event. If fragments from a comet or asteroid entered the atmosphere, they could create intense heat, fires across wide regions. This would leave behind traces, burned material, charcoal. And in some places, that is exactly what we find. But again, the story is not simple because similar layers are not found everywhere. And so the question remains, were these fires local or global? Were they caused by climate or something from space? As we continue, we find even smaller clues. Clues so tiny they can only be seen with powerful instruments. One of these is something called nanodiamonds. These are extremely small particles, much smaller than a grain of sand. They form under very high pressure and temperature, conditions that can occur during impacts or other extreme events. Some researchers have found nanodiamonds in sediments dating to the Younger Dryas. This has been used as evidence to support the idea of a cosmic impact. But once again, not all scientists agree. Some studies confirm their presence, others do not. And so the evidence remains uncertain, like a faint signal that is difficult to interpret. Now let us consider another type of clue, one that comes from plants. Plants are very sensitive to climate. Different types of plants grow in different conditions. Some prefer warmth, others can survive in cold environments. When scientists study ancient pollen preserved in soil or lake sediments, they can see what kinds of plants were present at different times. And during the Younger Dryas, they observe a shift. Warm, loving plants begin to disappear in certain regions. Cold-tolerant plants take their place. This is another confirmation, another quiet piece of evidence. The climate truly did change, and it changed in a noticeable way. But perhaps one of the most interesting clues comes from something we cannot see directly, something we must infer: wind patterns. During this cold period, the movement of air across the planet may have shifted. Storm tracks may have changed. Rainfall patterns may have moved. Some regions may have become drier, others wetter. These changes can be detected indirectly, through things like dust deposits or changes in lake levels. And when scientists study these patterns, they begin to see that the Younger Dryas was not just a simple cooling event. It was a complex shift in the entire climate system. Ocean currents, atmosphere, ice, land, all interacting, all changing together. Now let us return again gently to the oceans, because they remain at the center of many theories. The idea of ocean circulation disruption is supported by several lines of evidence. For example, in the North Atlantic, scientists have found changes in the types of tiny organisms that lived in the ocean. These organisms, called foraminifera, build small shells, and their shells contain chemical signatures. By studying these signatures, scientists can estimate the temperature and salinity of the water in which they lived. And during the Younger Dryas, these signals suggest cooler conditions, changes in ocean circulation. It is like listening to a quiet echo from the past. Another clue comes from isotopes. Certain elements like oxygen exist in slightly different forms called isotopes. The ratio of these isotopes can change depending on temperature. By studying oxygen isotopes in ice cores and sediments, scientists can reconstruct past climates. And once again, the signal is clear: a rapid cooling, followed by a long cold period. So now we have many clues: ice cores, sediments, pollen, ocean data, isotopes, all pointing to the same event, but still the cause remains uncertain. This is what makes the Younger Dryas so fascinating. It is not a mystery because we lack evidence. It is a mystery because the evidence is complex, sometimes even contradictory. Now let us consider one more subtle idea: feedback loops. In nature, small changes can sometimes amplify themselves. For example, if the Earth becomes slightly colder, more ice can form, and ice reflects sunlight. So more ice means more reflection, which leads to further cooling. This is called a positive feedback loop. During the Younger Dryas, such feedbacks may have played an important role. A small initial change, perhaps caused by freshwater input, could have triggered larger changes. Cooling leading to more ice leading to more cooling. A quiet chain reaction. And once started, it could continue for a long time, until something changed again. And eventually, something did. But before we reach that point, there is still more to explore, because hidden within this scientific mystery are questions not just about the past, but about the present and the future. If the climate could change so quickly once, could it happen again? What conditions would be needed? And are any of those conditions quietly developing even now? These are not questions with simple answers, but they are worth thinking about slowly, gently. As we continue this journey, we will begin to connect this ancient event to the world we live in today, not in a dramatic way, but in a thoughtful, reflective way. Because sometimes the past does not just tell us what happened, it shows us what is possible. As we continue gently forward, let us move into some of the quieter, lesser-known ideas, not the main explanations that are often discussed, but the subtle possibilities that exist at the edges of understanding. Because sometimes the truth of a mystery is not found in one single cause, but in many small influences coming together. One such idea involves volcanoes. Volcanoes are powerful but also quiet in their long-term influence. When a large eruption occurs, it can send ash and gases high into the atmosphere. Some of these gases, especially sulfur dioxide, can form tiny particles that reflect sunlight. This reduces the amount of heat reaching the Earth's surface, and for a short time, the planet can cool. We have seen this even in recent history. After major eruptions, global temperatures can drop slightly for a few years. But here is the question: Could a series of volcanic eruptions close together in time have caused a longer cooling period? It is possible. If multiple eruptions happened over decades, they could have created a more lasting effect, a slow dimming of sunlight, a gradual cooling. However, when scientists look at the evidence from ice cores, they do not find strong signs of continuous volcanic activity at the exact start of the Younger Dryas. There are traces of eruptions, yes, but not enough to fully explain such a sudden and long-lasting shift. So again, this idea remains in the background, a quiet possibility but not the full answer. Now, let us turn our attention even farther away beyond the Earth itself, to the Sun. The Sun may seem constant, unchanging, but in reality, its energy output can vary slightly over time. These variations are usually small, but over long periods, even small changes can have an effect. There are cycles in solar activity, periods of higher energy and periods of lower energy. If, around 12,800 years ago, the Sun entered a quieter phase, it could have contributed to cooling on Earth. But once again, the evidence is not strong enough to say this was the main cause. It may have played a role, a small influence, adding to other changes already taking place. And this brings us back to an important idea, that the Younger Dryas may not have been caused by one event, but by a combination of many. A release of freshwater into the oceans, a disruption of currents, changes in atmospheric patterns, perhaps small contributions from volcanic activity, maybe even slight changes in solar energy, all working together. Each one alone not enough, but together powerful. Like many small streams joining into a river. Now let us explore another subtle clue, one that comes from the land itself. In certain regions, scientists have studied ancient shorelines, the edges of lakes and seas. By looking at where water once stood, they can understand how climate affected rainfall and evaporation. During the Younger Dryas, some lakes shrank, others grew. This tells us something important, that the climate changes were not the same everywhere. In some places, it became drier, in others wetter. This suggests that wind patterns and rainfall systems were shifting. And when winds change, they carry heat differently. They move moisture differently, which can create complex patterns across the planet. Now let us consider another quiet piece of the puzzle: methane. Methane is a gas found in the atmosphere. It comes from natural sources like wetlands and also from biological activity. When scientists study ice cores, they can measure methane levels from the past. And during the Younger Dryas, methane levels dropped. This suggests that wetlands may have shrunk, that certain ecosystems changed. And this fits with the idea of a colder, drier world in many regions. But it also shows something deeper, that the climate system is connected not just to oceans and air, but to life itself. Plants, animals, microorganisms, all part of the system, all responding and influencing in small ways. Now, as we move a little further, let us return once more to the idea of timing. Because one of the most puzzling aspects of the Younger Dryas is not just that it happened, but how quickly it began and how quickly it ended. The start appears sudden, and the end also sudden. Around 11,700 years ago, temperatures rose rapidly. In ice core records, this warming looks almost like a sharp line, a sudden shift. It is as if a switch was turned. And this raises another quiet question. What could turn such a system on and off so quickly? If ocean circulation slowed down, what caused it to restart? If feedback loops kept the planet cold, what broke those loops? Some scientists believe that the freshwater input eventually stopped. As the ice sheets continued to melt, the large lakes may have drained in different directions or stabilized. Without the extra freshwater, the ocean circulation could have recovered. Warm water began flowing north again, and with that the climate shifted. Warming returned, ice retreated, ecosystems changed once more, and the Earth entered a new phase, a more stable one. But even here there is something worth noticing. The stability we experience today, the relatively predictable seasons, the climate that allowed agriculture to develop, it began only after this event, which means that for a long time before that, the Earth's climate was less stable, more variable, more uncertain. And this brings us gently to a thoughtful reflection. The world we live in now feels steady, reliable, but in the deeper history of the Earth, that stability is not always the norm. Sometimes the system shifts quietly but powerfully, and when it does, life adapts. As time passes slowly, we begin to see the Younger Dryas not just as a mystery, but as a reminder. A reminder that even large systems can change quickly, that small imbalances can grow into larger ones, and that understanding these patterns is something humans continue to learn step by step. Now, as we move forward in this story, we will begin to explore something more personal. Not just the science, but the human experience within this changing world. How people may have understood these shifts without the tools or knowledge we have today. What stories they might have told, what meanings they might have found in a world that no longer behaved as expected. And how slowly, quietly, these experiences may have shaped the early paths of human civilization. As we continue gently forward, let us now turn towards something more human. Not measurements, not ice cores, not particles hidden in the soil, but memory. Because even though there were no written records 12,800 years ago, humans were still observers, quiet observers of the world around them. They watched the sky. They noticed the seasons. They remembered patterns. And when those patterns changed, they would have felt it deeply. Imagine living in a world where everything depends on rhythm, the return of animals, the growth of plants, the timing of rains. And then slowly those rhythms begin to shift, not all at once, but enough to feel uncertain. At first, it may have seemed like a bad season, a colder winter, a shorter summer. But then it continued, year after year. The land no longer behaved the way it once did. And when that happens, people begin to search for meaning, not in numbers or scientific explanations, but in stories. Stories are one of the oldest ways humans understand change. They give shape to uncertainty. They turn confusion into something that can be shared, remembered, passed on. Now, we must move carefully here, because we do not have direct evidence of specific stories from this exact time. But we do have something interesting. Across many cultures around the world, there are ancient stories of sudden change, of cold, of darkness, of a world that shifted unexpectedly. Some speak of a time when the sun weakened. Others describe long winters or seasons that did not behave as they should. These stories appear in different places at different times, and while they cannot be directly linked to the Younger Dryas, they invite a quiet question. Could some of these stories carry distant echoes of real events? Not exact memories, not detailed records, but impressions, feelings passed down over generations. It is a gentle idea, one that cannot be proven easily, but also not dismissed completely. Because human memory, especially in oral traditions, can travel far through time. It changes, it transforms, but sometimes a small part remains. Now let us shift slightly from stories to places. Because around the end of the Younger Dryas, something remarkable appears in the archaeological record. In a region we now call Göbekli Tepe, large stone structures were built, massive pillars arranged in circles, carved with animals, symbols, patterns. This site is very old, more than 11,000 years old, which places it right at the end of this cold period. And what makes it even more interesting is that it was built before the widespread development of agriculture. The people who built it were still hunter-gatherers. Yet they came together, organized labor, moved heavy stones, created something lasting. Why? That is another quiet mystery. Some researchers suggest that environmental stress, like the instability of the Younger Dryas, may have encouraged people to gather in larger groups, to cooperate more. Perhaps places like Göbekli Tepe were not just structures, but centers of shared experience, shared meaning, places where people came together to make sense of a changing world, to create order in a time of uncertainty. We cannot know exactly what they thought, but we can imagine gently. A group of people standing among tall stone pillars, looking at carvings of animals they depended on, animals that may have been disappearing or changing their patterns. Feeling the cold air, sensing that the world was different than it used to be. And in that moment, trying to understand. Now, let us consider another quiet shift. During this time and shortly after, we begin to see early signs of agriculture. Not full farming as we know it, but small steps, experiments. People beginning to plant seeds intentionally, to stay in one place longer. Why would this happen? One possibility is necessity. When the environment becomes less predictable, relying only on wild resources becomes more difficult. So people begin to take small steps toward control, planting, tending, observing. And over time, these small steps grow into something larger. Agriculture, villages, eventually, civilizations. So here is a quiet thought. What if this period of sudden cold, this disruption, this mystery was not just an obstacle but also a turning point? A moment that gently pushed humanity in a new direction, not quickly, not intentionally, but slowly over generations. Now, as we sit with this idea, let us return to the feeling of the story. A world growing colder, people adapting, patterns shifting, and somewhere within that, new ways of living beginning to form. It is not a dramatic transformation. It is quiet, gradual, but deeply important. As time passes, the cold period comes to an end, the climate stabilizes, and in that stability, human societies begin to grow in new ways. But the memory of change, the experience of uncertainty that may have stayed, not as clear facts, but as a feeling, a sense that the world can shift, and perhaps a quiet desire to understand it. As we continue this journey, we will move even closer to the present. Not suddenly, but gently. We will begin to reflect on what this ancient mystery means for us today. Not in a way that creates worry, but in a way that invites awareness, understanding. Because sometimes looking far into the past helps us see the present more clearly. As we continue gently forward, let us now bring this quiet story a little closer to our own time, not in a sudden way, but slowly, like watching the horizon change as the night passes. The Younger Dryas, this strange and sudden return to cold, is not only a story about the past, it is also, in a very subtle way, a window into how the Earth behaves. Because one of the most important things it shows us is that the climate system is not always smooth, not always gradual. Sometimes it shifts. For a long time, scientists believed that large changes in climate always took thousands, even tens of thousands of years. A slow movement, almost too slow to notice within a human life. But the evidence from around 12,800 years ago suggests something different. That under certain conditions, the system can change much faster. Not overnight in the way we might imagine, but fast enough that a single generation could feel the difference. And this idea, this possibility, has quietly changed the way scientists think about climate. Now, let us return once more to the oceans, because even today, they continue to play a central role. The same system we spoke about earlier, the slow movement of warm and cold water through the Atlantic, still exists, still flows. It carries warmth from the equator toward the north, helping to keep regions like Europe milder than they would otherwise be. But this system is sensitive. It depends on temperature, on salinity, on balance. And when that balance shifts, the system can weaken. Today, scientists observe this circulation carefully. They measure its strength, they watch for changes, and some studies suggest that it may be slowing slightly, not stopping, not collapsing, but changing. Now, this does not mean that a sudden event like the Younger Dryas is about to happen again. The conditions today are different. The world is warmer, not cooling. But the lesson remains that the climate system has thresholds, points where gradual change can lead to more sudden shifts. And understanding those thresholds, one of the most important challenges in modern science. Now, let us think about this in a simple way. Imagine a cup filled almost to the top with water. You can add small drops one by one and nothing seems to happen. But at some point, One more drop causes the water to spill over. The change appears sudden, but it was built slowly. The Younger Dryas may have been something like this. Gradual changes building over time until a threshold was reached, and then a rapid shift. This idea is sometimes called a tipping point. It is a quiet concept, but a powerful one, because it suggests that not all change is linear, not all change is predictable. Sometimes the system waits, and then it moves. Now, as we reflect on this, there is no need for urgency or concern in this moment. Instead, there is something else: awareness. An understanding that the Earth is a complex system, connected in ways that are not always visible. Oceans influencing atmosphere, ice influencing sunlight, life influencing gases, all part of a delicate balance. And this balance has shifted before, many times across the long history of the planet. Now let us return gently to the human side, because while the Earth moves through these changes, humans continue to live within them, to adapt, to respond, just as they did 12,800 years ago. But today something is different. We have knowledge. We can study the past. We can observe patterns. We can understand systems, at least in part. And this gives us something those early humans did not have: the ability to anticipate, to prepare, to reflect consciously on what is happening. But even with all this knowledge, there are still mysteries. The Younger Dryas remains one of them, because despite all the data, all the research, we still do not know exactly what caused it. And perhaps that is an important part of the story, that even with advanced tools, there are moments in Earth's history that remain uncertain, not fully explained. And in that uncertainty, there is something quietly humbling, a reminder that we are still learning, still exploring. Now, as we move toward a deeper reflection, let us consider one final idea. What if the importance of this event is not only in its cause, but in its message? Not a message in words, but in pattern. A pattern that shows us how the Earth can change, how systems can respond, how life adapts, and how, even in times of uncertainty, new paths can emerge. Because from this cold period, from this disruption, came a more stable climate. And within that stability, human civilization began to grow. Farming, settlements, culture. Everything we know today has roots in the time that followed. So the Younger Dryas sits quietly at the edge of that transformation, a final moment of instability before a long period of balance. And perhaps without it, the path of human history might have been different. We cannot know for certain, but we can sit with the idea, gently, that sometimes periods of change, even difficult ones, play a role in shaping what comes next. As time passes slowly and this story begins to settle, we are left not with a single answer, but with a collection of possibilities. Freshwater flows, ocean currents, dust, impacts, feedback loops, all part of a larger picture. A picture that is still incomplete, still forming. And maybe that is where the quiet beauty of this story lies. Not in solving the mystery completely, but in exploring it, step by step, layer by layer, like reading the Earth itself. As we continue, let us not rush toward an ending. Instead, let us slow down even more. Because this story, like the layers of ice and earth it comes from, does not truly end, it simply becomes quieter. Imagine, for a moment, the world just after the Younger Dryas had finally passed. The cold had loosened its hold, not suddenly, but enough to be felt. Winters became softer, summers stretched a little longer. The land, which had once seemed uncertain, began to settle into a more familiar rhythm. Rivers flowed more steadily. Forests slowly expanded. Grasses returned to places that had been harsh and empty. And the animals, those that remained, began to follow more predictable paths again. For the humans living in that time, this change would not have been described in words like stability or climate phase, but they would have felt it in the ease of finding food, in the return of patterns they could trust. And trust in a natural world is something very important, because when the world behaves in expected ways, humans can begin to plan, not just for the next day or the next season, but for something further ahead. And it is here, in this quiet return of predictability, that something new begins to take shape. People begin to stay. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in certain places slowly. They return to the same areas again and again. They begin to recognize which lands are more reliable, which rivers do not dry up, which plants return each year. And over time, these places become more than temporary stops. They become early homes. It is a very gentle shift, almost invisible at first, but it changes everything. Because when people stay in one place, they begin to observe more closely. They notice how seeds fall, how plants grow, how the soil changes with the seasons. And without fully intending to, they begin to interact with these patterns. Perhaps scattering seeds, perhaps clearing small areas, perhaps protecting certain plants. Small actions, repeated over time. And from these small actions, a new relationship with the land begins to form. This is not yet farming as we know it, but it is the beginning of something. Something that would slowly grow over generations into agriculture. And agriculture would change human life forever. But here, in this moment, it is still quiet, still simple, just people and land and observation. Now let us pause gently on this idea, because it connects back to something deeper. The Younger Dryas, with all its uncertainty, may have created conditions where adaptation became necessary. And adaptation often leads to innovation, not through sudden invention, but through gradual change, trial and error, observation and memory. And over time, these small changes accumulate until something entirely new begins to appear. Now, as we sit with this thought, let us return once more to the earth itself. The climate after this period entered what we now call the Holocene, a time of relative stability, a time in which seasonal patterns became more predictable. This stability has lasted for thousands of years, long enough for civilizations to rise, for cultures to develop, for knowledge to grow. But beneath this stability, the deeper nature of the earth has not changed. It is still a dynamic system, still capable of shifting. The Younger Dryas reminds us of that, quietly, without urgency, just as a memory. Now imagine again those early humans, standing on a landscape that is slowly becoming more familiar, more reliable. They do not know about ice cores, they do not know about ocean currents, but they know the land, they know the sky, and they carry something important: experience. They have lived through change, through uncertainty, through a world that did not always behave as expected, and that experience becomes part of who they are. It shapes how they think, how they respond, how they plan. And perhaps in ways we cannot fully see, it influences the path that human societies take. Now, as this story becomes softer, we can begin to reflect, not on a single cause, not on a final answer, but on the nature of the mystery itself. Because the Younger Dryas is not just a question waiting to be solved, it is also a reminder that the earth holds stories that are complex, layered, sometimes incomplete, and that understanding them requires patience, careful observation, and a willingness to accept uncertainty. As time passes slowly, the details of this event fade into the background of history, but its influence remains. In the climate we live in the development of human societies, and in the questions that scientists continue to ask, questions that may take many more years, perhaps even generations, to answer fully. And that is all right, because not all mysteries need to be solved quickly. Some are meant to be explored slowly, like this one. As we continue, let us gently follow that quiet path, the one that leads from a changing climate into the very first beginnings of civilization. There is no clear moment where everything suddenly changes, no single day when humans decide, now we will build cities. Instead, it happens slowly, so slowly that no one living at the time would have noticed the full transformation. But if we could watch from a distance across many generations, we would begin to see it. At first, small groups return to the same places again and again. Places where water is reliable, where plants grow well, where animals pass through regularly. These places begin to feel familiar. Over time, the visits become longer, a few weeks, then months, then perhaps entire seasons. Simple shelters are built, nothing permanent at first, just enough to provide comfort, protection from wind, from cold nights. And then something subtle begins to change. Instead of only taking from the land, a people begin to influence it. They may clear small patches of ground. They may notice which plants grow better and begin to favor them. They may return seeds to the soil without fully understanding that they are planting. But slowly the relationship shifts from gathering to guiding. And this shift, though quiet, is one of the most important in human history. Now let us imagine one of these early settlements, not a village as we know it, but a small gathering of people near a river. The air is calm. The seasons are becoming more predictable now. People move about slowly. Some are preparing food, others are shaping tools. Children watch, learn, explore. There is no sense yet of civilization, but there is something new, continuity. Life is no longer only about movement, it is beginning to include staying. And when people stay, they begin to build. Not just shelters, but habits, routines, ways of living that repeat. And from repetition comes structure. Now let us return again to a place we mentioned before, Göbekli Tepe. This place sits quietly at the edge of this transformation. It is not a city, not a farm, and yet it is something more than a simple camp. Massive stone pillars rise from the ground, arranged in circles, carved with animals, symbols, shapes that still puzzle us today. The people who built this did not have metal tools, they did not have writing, and yet they created something that required planning, coordination, effort over time, which suggests something important, that humans, even before full civilization, were already capable of complex cooperation. Now let us sit gently with this image. A group of people working together, lifting stone, carving shapes, returning day after day. Why? We do not know for certain. Some believe it may have been a place of gathering, of shared meaning, perhaps even early forms of belief or ritual. Others think it may have helped bring people together at a time when the world had been uncertain, a way of creating stability not in the environment but in human connection. And this idea is worth pausing on, because when the outer world is unpredictable, humans often create inner structures, stories, symbols, places, ways to feel grounded. And Göbekli Tepe may have been one of the earliest expressions of that. Now, as time continues to pass, these small settlements grow. Not all at once, not everywhere, but in certain regions where conditions allow. People begin to rely more on planted food. They begin to store resources. And storage changes something important. It allows planning beyond the present moment. Food is no longer only what is found today. It becomes something that can be saved, protected, used later. And from this, new ideas begin to form. Ownership, responsibility, community roles. Some people may focus more on growing food, others on making tools, others on organizing. And slowly, society becomes more complex. But even as this happens, the memory of change, of uncertainty, may still linger quietly in the background, not as a clear thought, but as a feeling, a sense that the world is not always stable, that it can shift. And perhaps this awareness encourages people to build systems that feel more secure, to create order. Now, as we move further into this gentle unfolding, we begin to see the early shapes of civilization. Small villages, clusters of homes, shared spaces. Nothing like modern cities, but the beginnings are there. And all of this, all of it, follows after that long, cold period, after the Younger Dryas, which brings us back once more to a quiet reflection. What if that period of sudden change, that return to cold, that disruption, was part of the reason these developments began? Not the only reason, not in a simple cause and effect way, but as one piece of a much larger story. A moment that challenged human life, and in doing so, encouraged adaptation. And from adaptation came transformation. Now, as this part of the story settles, we can feel the pace slowing again. The world is becoming more familiar, more stable. Human life is becoming more structured. And yet, beneath it all, the deeper patterns of the earth continue. Quiet, complex, waiting. As we continue from here, we can drift even further into a calm, almost timeless reflection on how all of this connects: the earth, the climate, human life, and the slow unfolding of history. As we continue, we will not close the story just yet. Instead, we will let it drift a little further into the quiet spaces between what we know and what we can only imagine. The early villages grow slowly, not in straight lines, not with careful planning, but organically, like plants spreading where conditions allow. A few homes become several, several become a cluster. Paths begin to form between them, not built, just walked again and again, until the Arabic Halif, Arabic lamb, Arabic Hamza Tatalif, Arabic Rot, Arabic Dada remembers the steps. Smoke rises gently from small fires. Food is prepared. Tools are shaped with patience. Life moves at a steady rhythm now, not as uncertain as before, but not fully controlled either. And within this rhythm, something else begins to appear: memory. Not just of events, but of knowledge. People begin to remember not only what happened, but how things work. Which plants grow best in certain soils, when to plant, when to wait, how to shape stone more effectively, how to build stronger shelters. And this knowledge slowly is passed on, from one person to another, from one generation to the next. Not written, not recorded, but carried in voices, in actions, in quiet observation. And over time, this shared knowledge becomes something powerful, because it allows people to build upon what came before. Now let us pause gently here, because this is another turning point, not as visible as a sudden climate shift, not as dramatic as a world growing cold, but just as important: the moment when knowledge begins to accumulate, when each generation does not start from the beginning, but from where the last one left off. And this, more than anything, is what allows civilization to grow. Now let us look again at the land. The climate is stable for now. Seasons return in expected ways. Rain falls when it should. Rivers rise and fall in patterns that can be learned. And with this stability, agriculture becomes more intentional. Seeds are no longer scattered by chance. They are planted with purpose. Fields begin to take shape, simple at first, but recognizable. And with fields come boundaries. Not walls yet, but ideas. This area is used, that area is left. And from these ideas, new kinds of relationships begin to form, between people and land, between people and each other. Now, as we move a little deeper, we begin to notice something subtle but meaningful. Time itself starts to feel different. For hunter-gatherers, time is often guided by movement, by following animals, by responding to immediate needs. But for those who begin to farm, time becomes something to plan. There is a right moment to plant, a right moment to harvest, and missing that moment can have consequences. So attention to time becomes sharper, more deliberate. And from this awareness, eventually, much later, comes the idea of calendars. But here, in this early stage, it is still simple, still connected to the sky, to the position of the sun, the cycles of the moon. Now let us return once more gently to the idea of memory, because while knowledge is growing, so too are stories. Stories about the past, about times when the world was different, colder, less predictable. These stories may not describe the younger Dryas directly, but they may carry its feeling, a sense that the world once changed in ways that were difficult to understand. And these stories passed down through generations become part of culture, part of how people see the world. Now, as the villages grow, connections between groups begin to form. People meet, exchange goods, share ideas. And with these connections, knowledge spreads further, not just within one place but across regions. And slowly, over long stretches of time, these networks become more complex, leading eventually to larger communities, to early towns. But even as this happens, the deeper memory of the earth remains, hidden beneath the surface, in ice, in soil, in stone. The story of sudden change still there, waiting to be discovered thousands of years later. Now let us slow down even more. Imagine the quiet of an early evening in one of these small settlements. The air is calm, the light is soft. People gather near fires, sharing food, speaking in low voices. Children listen, learning not just skills but stories, stories of animals, of seasons, of things that happened long ago. And somewhere within those stories, perhaps, just perhaps, is a distant echo of a time when the world grew cold, when the familiar patterns disappeared, not remembered clearly, not described in detail, but felt as a quiet awareness that the world can change and that humans must adapt. As we sit with this image, the story becomes softer still, no longer focused on events but on continuity, the passing of time, the slow unfolding of life. From ice to cold winds to uncertainty to adaptation to settlement to the first quiet steps toward civilization, all connected, all part of a single long journey. And still, even now, we have not reached an end, because this story, like history itself, does not truly end. It continues, in the present, in the systems we live within, in the knowledge we carry, and in the questions we still ask. As we continue, let us drift gently into that deeper, quieter flow, not moving forward quickly, but allowing the story to soften and widen like ripples on still water. By now, the world has settled into a calmer rhythm. The long cold has passed. The Arabic Khalif, Arabic lamb, Arabic Hamzatat Talif, Arabic Rot, Arabic Dada feels more predictable, more familiar beneath human feet. And yet, something from that ancient time remains, not in the air, not in the temperature, but in the quiet awareness that change is always possible. The people living in these early settlements do not speak of climate systems. They do not measure time in thousands of years. But they feel the cycles, the returning seasons, the small differences between one year and the next. And slowly, over generations, they begin to trust the land again. Trust that the seeds they place into the soil will return. Trust that the rains will come more often than not. And with trust comes a certain kind of peace, a soft confidence in the world. But it is not complete certainty. It is something more balanced. because somewhere deep within shared memory, there is still a quiet understanding that the world has changed before. And so life continues in this gentle space between trust and awareness. Now imagine time passing, not days or months, but generations. Children grow into adults. They teach what they have learned. They add small improvements, small ideas. A slightly better way to shape a tool, a slightly better place to plant. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, but each small change builds upon the last. And over time, these small changes become something larger. Villages become more stable, more organized. Homes are built with greater care, structures last longer, paths become more defined, spaces begin to have meaning, a place for gathering, a place for working, a place for rest. And within this growing structure, human life becomes more layered, not just survival but experience. Moments of quiet conversation, moments of shared work, moments of stillness, watching the sky at the end of the day. And always above them, the same sky that watched the younger Dryas begin and end. Now, as we move even deeper into this calm reflection, let us consider something almost invisible: the passing of knowledge through time. Not just practical knowledge, but understanding. Each generation inherits a world shaped by the last, and without realizing it, they also inherit the results of past changes. The stabilized climate, the growing forests, the fertile land. All of these are part of a long chain of events that includes that distant, mysterious cold period. Which means, in a quiet way, that the younger Dryas is still part of their world, even if they do not know its name. Now, as the rhythm of life continues, we begin to see something else emerge. Connection between people, between places, paths between settlements become more familiar. People begin to travel not just for survival, but for exchange. They share tools, food, ideas. And through these exchanges, the world becomes slightly larger, not in size, but in awareness. And this awareness slowly becomes the foundation for something even greater. But we will not rush there. Instead, let us stay here a little longer in this quiet moment. The firelight flickers, voices are soft. The Arabic Khalif, Arabic Lam, Arabic Hamzatat Talif, Arabic Rat, Arabic Dada holds the memory of ice, but the air is calm. And somewhere, far beyond what anyone here can see, the deeper systems of the earth continue to move. Oceans flowing, winds shifting, ice forming and melting in distant places. All part of a vast system that once shifted suddenly and could one day shift again. But here in this moment there is stillness. And within that stillness life continues. Slowly, gently. Now as the story becomes softer still, we can feel it moving toward a place of rest. Not an ending, but a quiet pause. A place where everything we have seen, the ice, the sudden cold, the mystery, the adaptation, the first settlements, all settle together like layers of earth. And from those layers the present has grown. If you listen very quietly, it almost feels as though the past is still there, not gone, just resting beneath everything we see. And perhaps that is the final feeling to carry forward, that the world we live in is built upon many unseen stories. Some understood, some still mysterious. And among them is the quiet, unresolved story of 12,800 years ago. A moment when the earth changed and no one knew why. And even now, we are still listening, still learning, still wondering. As we continue, let us drift even more slowly now, as if the story itself is beginning to breathe more softly. There is something gentle about looking so far into the past, so far that the details fade and only patterns remain. The pattern of change, the pattern of adaptation, the pattern of quiet survival. The Younger Dryas, once a sharp and sudden event in our story, now feels distant, almost like a memory seen through fog. And yet its presence is still here, not as cold air, but as a quiet influence that shaped everything that followed. The villages we imagined, the early fields, the slow gathering of knowledge, all of it rests on a world that became stable again. A world that allowed humans to pause, to stay, to build. And from that building came everything. But let us not move too quickly into what came next. Instead, let us remain here in this soft, early moment of human life. The fire burns low, the night is calm. Above, the stars stretch across the sky just as they did 12,800 years ago. Unchanged, silent. Early humans would have looked at these stars often, not with telescopes, not with scientific questions, but with quiet attention, watching patterns, noticing movement, perhaps finding comfort in their consistency. Because while the Arabic Khalif, Arabic lamb, Arabic Hamza Tatalif, Arabic Rot, Arabic Dada could change, the sky seemed steady. And in that steadiness there is a kind of peace. Now, as time continues its slow movement, let us imagine many generations passing. So many that the memory of the great cold is no longer even a feeling. It has faded completely. What remains instead is a world that feels normal, stable. And in that stability, human life becomes more confident. Settlements grow larger, connections deepen, but still everything is grounded in simple rhythms. Sunrise, sunset, seasons turning, and within these rhythms there is a sense of balance. Now let us pause again and notice something subtle. Even though the Younger Dryas has ended, even though the climate has stabilized, the deeper nature of the earth has not changed. It is still a system of movement, of balance, of quiet forces interacting. The oceans still flow, the winds still shift, the ice still forms and melts. All of it continues whether humans notice or not, and this is something easy to forget, because from a human perspective life feels steady. Years pass in familiar ways, seasons return as expected, and so it is natural to assume that this stability will continue. But the deeper history of the earth tells a different story. A story of cycles, of shifts, of moments when everything changes. More quickly than expected. Not often, not constantly, but enough to remind us that stability is something that exists within a larger pattern of change. Now, as we sit with this thought, there is no need to feel concern. Instead, there is something quieter, perspective, a sense of how vast time is, how many changes have already taken place, and how life again and again finds a way to continue. From the great ice sheets to the sudden cold to the warming that followed, humans remained, adapted, learned, and slowly built something lasting. Now, as the story softens even further, it begins to feel less like a sequence of events and more like a reflection, a quiet meditation on time, on Earth, on the way small changes can shape large outcomes, and how even mysteries like the cause of the Younger Dryas can still hold meaning even without clear answers. Because sometimes the value is not in solving the mystery completely, but in what the mystery shows us. That the world is complex, that it is connected, and that understanding it is a slow and ongoing journey. Now imagine once more that early landscape. The air is still, the land is calm, a small settlement rests near water, people sleep, the fire has dimmed to embers, and above the stars continue their quiet movement. Nothing feels urgent, nothing feels uncertain, just stillness. And beneath that stillness, layers of time. Ice that once covered the land, cold winds that once shaped the world. All of it now resting deep below, invisible but not gone. And perhaps that is the final feeling we can rest with for now. That everything we see, everything we live within is part of a much longer story. A story that began long before us and will continue long after. And somewhere within that story is a quiet moment, 12,800 years ago when the earth changed, and no one knew why. And even now, as we sit in the present, that question remains. Soft, unanswered, waiting. As we come to the end of this long and quiet journey, let us slow down one last time, not to stop the story suddenly, but to allow it to settle gently like dust returning to the ground after a long wind. We began far back in time, in a world just beginning to warm after the long ice age. A world that felt as though it was slowly moving toward balance again. And then unexpectedly the earth changed. Temperatures dropped. Cold returned. Rivers shifted, animals moved, and the rhythms of life became uncertain. This was the mysterious moment we now call the Younger Dryas, a period that began around 12,800 years ago, a shift so sudden that even today scientists still study it with curiosity. Ice cores from places like Greenland hold quiet evidence of that change, layers of ancient air, telling us that the world cooled rapidly and stayed that way for many centuries. Yet the cause remains uncertain. Perhaps freshwater from melting ice disrupted the great ocean currents. Perhaps dust, feedback loops, or other natural systems combined together. Some have even wondered whether fragments from space played a role. But no single answer explains everything. And so, the mystery remains. But the story was never only about the cause. It was also about what happened next. During that long, cold period, humans continued to live. They adapted quietly, just as people always have. They moved when necessary. They learned new ways to survive. They watched the land carefully. And when the cold finally ended around 11,700 years ago, the Earth entered a calmer chapter, a climate more stable than the one before it. In that stability, something remarkable slowly began to grow. Small settlements, early experiments with plants, the first steps toward agriculture. Places like Göbekli Tepe remind us that even before cities existed, humans were already gathering, building, and creating meaning together. Over many generations, villages formed. Knowledge passed from parent to child. Seeds were planted with intention. Communities slowly expanded. And from those quiet beginnings, civilization eventually emerged. So in a way, the mysterious cold period at the end of the Ice Age sits quietly at the edge of a turning point in human history. Not as a dramatic moment that changed everything instantly, but as part of a long chain of events that shaped the world we now live in. Today, thousands of years later, we can look back and see only fragments, ice layers, ancient pollen, sediments at the bottom of lakes, stone structures left behind by people who never wrote their stories down. And from those fragments we try to understand, patiently, piece by piece. Some questions we have answered, others remain open. But perhaps that is part of what makes history so calming to explore. There is always more to learn, more to notice, more to quietly wonder about. And as we reach this gentle ending, we can step back and see the story not just as a mystery, but as a reminder. The Earth has changed many times before. Life has adapted again and again. And human curiosity, the quiet desire to understand the world, has continued across generations. The people who lived through that cold period never knew that thousands of years later, others would study the traces they left behind. They simply lived day by day, season by season. And yet, their world became the beginning of ours. Now the story rests. The winds that once carried the cold are silent in the past. The ice holds its memories deep within the earth. And the mystery of 12,800 years ago remains, calm, quiet, and still not fully solved. So as the night grows peaceful and the mind begins to slow, we can leave the story here. Not with a loud ending, but with a soft understanding. That history is not only about answers. Sometimes it is about listening to the past and letting its quiet questions remain. And somewhere far back in time, under layers of ice and soil, the moment when the earth suddenly grew cold continues to rest, waiting quietly in the long story of our planet.